The first question that I wanted to ask, when did you know it was time to write this book?
Well, interestingly, it was long before the recent election. The idea to write the book came out of Forces for Good, which the big insight was that great nonprofits build movements, not just shore up their organizations. And I was looking at groups like Teach for America, Habitat for Humanity, National Council La Raza, all post-civil rights era organizations that had grown from zero to great. So then I started thinking, well, if you've got to build a movement, what does it take to build an effective movement? So we started the research back in 2013, 2014. And then, of course, I think the world changed in many ways given our current political situation.
Can you tell us a little bit about a current movement that excites you and then one that scares you?
Wow. Me Too, and this focus on gender equality and specifically sexual assault is having its moment now. I think this reckoning, and despite, in my opinion, the missteps and the Senate hearings with our recent confirmation, when you look at the private sector, during that same time, Bill Cosby went to jail, Harvey Weinstein is still on trial. The private sector men who are harassing women are being held account, and that has changed. The public sector, we have a long way to go. And I think a lot about the Me Too movement in the context of a lot of the lessons in this book and around changing hearts. When the drunk driving cause came about, the idea was friends don't let friends drive drunk, right? But that also, as I said, was not a policy. There was no law. It was already illegal to drive drunk. It's also illegal to harass women in the workplace, right? It's illegal to sexually assault somebody. Almost all workers are protected except for some of the gig economy and some of the for-profit workspace. So it's illegal. We know it's wrong, and yet the rampant, vicious behavior continues. So how do you change a norm? And I feel that it's incumbent upon, as women are speaking up for themselves, it's who has the power to stop this? It's men, right? Men shouldn't let other men. Men need to hold each other accountable. So I like the he for she movement, where it's not all on us to stop it. What scares me? Well, certainly the gun rights movement scares me in how powerful and well it does the things that I wrote about. And I feel that the gun control or the gun safety side has almost 3 decades of work to make up for all that lost time, and it's going to be really, really hard. Another movement I will say that inspires me and scares some people, I think about Black Lives Matter. It's unfortunate that movement, and we'll talk about this in the Q&A, has become, branded by the right as this terrorist, really extreme, when the fundamental idea is something so positive. And that's a conversation I think we should have about how do you move from just black people having to stand up for themselves to white communities, other communities embracing this. And maybe it has a different name, but it's got to change.
That's right. That's awesome. I have a question right here.
Yeah. Can you comment about movements that have been really effective intergenerationally? I mean, I can look at that cat video and think it's hysterical. I wouldn't have thought of it in a gazillion years. But the power of having young folks and not so young folks working together, how can we do that better? Are there examples of that? Thank you.
That's a good question. Certainly that Cat Mageddon series and the Truth Campaign, one of the reasons why it's so effective is it was helped developed by young people. So it came out of Florida. They had young people that are the target segment helping with the creative. They also hired a high-end Madison Avenue ad agency to help actually create the ads. But young people informed the content. So I think one of the really big principles in the book is movements that are successful are led by the people with the lived experience of the problem, whoever they are. So I would say, intergenerational to the extent that all generations are affected by a problem, involving them in co-creating the solutions and putting them up front. A big tenet with Mothers Against Drunk Driving is you couldn't lead a chapter or speak to the press unless you were a victim or you had a family member that was a victim. You had to have the lived experience and be able to speak authentically to it.
We have a question right here. Oh, sorry, wait for the mic. I didn't see that we're coming to you next.
All right, Lisa. So I had a question. It's a little tough to ask. I really like your last 2 points about leaderful and adversary allies. I feel like locally there's been a tension since Ferguson, since the death of Michael Brown, between activists and elected officials, and I would even say between good activists and good elected officials. How do we mend that, or any tactics to get those adversarial allies together closer and working together?
Well, one thing, I'm not surprised that tension exists. It exists, again, everywhere in every cause. One of the things that the winning movements I saw were able to do is one thing was not trying to get everybody 100% consensus, right? But it was sort of this 80-20 rule. If you can get most moving in the same direction. Secondly, they had convenings where they thought about things from a movement perspective, not just individual organizations, right? And a lot of it also had to do with trying to find those messages where it's not what are we against, because we're against a lot of what's going on, police brutality, the racial injustice, but also what are we for? And having that what are we for conversation, it becomes the pathway in to being able to collaborate rather than compete. But we'll talk more about that one when we get into the conversation with Michelle and the Workhouse campaign. Yeah.
Well, wait a minute.
Oh, no, sorry.
Mike, stand up.
Question. I'm very concerned, as many in this audience, is about quality early child care in our country, especially here in Missouri. Is there a movement that you can point to nationally that is doing well in advocating for quality early childhood?
Well, it's interesting you asked that. We just are talking with a couple groups right now about holding a movement accelerator at Georgetown to help gel and accelerate an early childhood movement. So follow up later, and maybe you can come. It's what in this field, as in so many, what you have is a lot of great organizations working at the state and local level, making progress, but not a nationally coordinated but locally relevant campaign. And one of the activists in the LGBT community, Mark Solomon, who was the national campaign director for marriage equality at Freedom to Marry, talks about in any movement you've got to have a federal strategy and a national strategy, meaning thinking state by state by state, but also federal. But you don't start with the federal; you got to do bottom up. So we should talk about that.
We got two over here. We got one back here. Oh, three. Okay, this is good.
I get scared when I see Trump have 47% approval rating last Sunday on one of those talk shows. And I'm seeing my guiding principles and core values go down the tubes and having fewer and fewer people share them. Are movements really about one issue, or can they be about bigger issues, such as guiding principles and core values and what we care about and who we are as a country?
I think that's a great question, and interested in other responses. I can tell you the lens I took was looking at changes that have happened, and by default, those were single issue, changes, environment, guns, smoking, right? I do know that in politics and in social change, single issue campaigns win because you can get the momentum and the strategic focus. So I don't know about the broader campaigns. And, I too share your fear and frustration with what I see happening in the country. And I did not study political movements, right? So I didn't study the populist movement that led to Trump. I didn't study the Tea Party. Many of these practices, however, are employed in political movements, and certainly the reason we are where we are is in part because of the assiduous organizing on the right for the Tea Party and the extreme turn the right has taken, tapping in to a few core issues. That is this racism, this fear, animosity towards immigrants. The wall really resonates with many supporters on Trump's side, and it's a visceral, fundamental, I think, wrong value, but it's very motivational. So again, I would say think about what are the values we're for, and how do we put those at the center of whether resistance or campaigns that are trying to move things back towards the center.
Yeah, question right here.
Hi, Leslie.
Hi.
I just finished Michael Lewis's book, The Fifth Risk. And in it, throughout, he talks about how all the incompetent people that the administration put into various agencies, energy, the nuclear safety, and all those things. He talks about that, but he also talks about a lot weather and weather predictions and the way people react to weather predictions. So in terms of movements and making movements work, how do you get to the point where you can convince the individual that their action or ability to actually move an issue is what really matters, what they do, versus what someone else does?
It's a great question. Part of that is up to the leadership in these movements. And the first, it's kind of not a direct answer to your question, but I think a lot about, when in the LGBT marriage equality fight, there was this focus on love, and that was marketing, messaging, right? And there was a lot of litigation, bringing marriage cases to the court. But another thing they did was they played hard and smart politics. And they realized we've got to elect people who will support gay marriage referendum on the ballot, right? And defend it if it becomes a law in a state. So a lot of the money went into political campaigns where advocates would help, at state, local councilman elections. And they realized, every little council election in and of itself is inconsequential, but it can add up to having a big impact on the state. So one thing is connecting where you act, how you individually behave, but also how you vote and how much voting matters if you want change to move in your direction.
That's right. I think we have time for one more question, and it's right there.
Good morning. I'd like to, you've looked at issues for a long period of time, and so you've looked at the trajectory of change over history. And I'm trying to assess kind of what the impact of social media has been on movements, particularly obviously on the messaging side of things, but the rate of change, the responsiveness of movements to that rate of change, the kind of leadership qualities that might be required, or what impact, if any, you've seen from social media.
Certainly social media has accelerated. And by the way, it's a tool available to all sides, right? So in gun control, the gun rights movement has really dominated and mastered it. And so now gun control has to play catch up, right? So the early adopters at using social media to connect with networks certainly has accelerated things, but everybody has equal access. I do think that the factor that has really bubbled up since I even finished the manuscript is this increasing polarization because of social media and the ability to isolate yourself into one, channel, if you will, and whether you're in the Fox News side or the MSNBC side. And the other thing that reinforces is this tribalism and this polarization that we experience more across the country. I have a colleague who talks about how before, it used to be a very low percent, about 5% of Democrats and Republicans held the belief that not only do I disagree with you if you're a Republican and I'm a Democrat, but you're trying to do something to harm the country. That was a very small segment. Today, it's flipped. It's more than 40%, maybe even half. If I'm a Republican, I think if you're a Democrat, not only do I disagree with you, I might still worship with you, or my kids might go to the same schools, but now I think you're evil, and I think you're trying to harm the country. And that is very, very different. It wasn't like that before. And I live in D.C., on the dating apps. What's the #1 filter now? What part are you in? Never used to be that way. So just a little fact. I know that's the last question. Did you have wrap-up comments? Because I had one more thought.
No, please share, and then we'll transition to the panel.
Okay. The last kind of thought I have that I wanted to leave with everyone is this. There's kind of like these truths across movements, and I think they exist across time, well beyond the time frame I studied. And the first one is this, that change is possible. You know, it's amazing to me that we live in a time where, you know, nobody's by and large smokes, gay marriage is the law of the land, guns are everywhere, just like cigarettes used to be a few decades ago, right? Like, all these changes happened in our lifetime, and it gets to the second point, which is change is really nonpartisan, right? Sometimes Trumpers and conservatives, the Tea Party win, and sometimes liberals and progressives win in our lifetimes, right? And so that leads to the third point, which is that it's not necessarily what party you're part of, or even faith, right? If God was on the side of any one of these issues, it's not clear to me which side she was on. If multiple gods were involved, there was not consensus, right? Like, we have this really bifurcated outcomes that we're living with today. So if it's not faith or party, then what is it? And the third point is that change is deliberate. We know that change happens because of the leadership, the actions of individual citizens, everyday leaders such as yourselves, that are the reasons why some changes happen and don't. And it's just the side that got organized better and more smartly wins. So let's talk about how to apply some of these practices to your campaigns in the next session. Thank you.
That's awesome.